Henry's hands were old. Calloused. Weathered by years of working on the fields, the war, and everything life had thrown at him. At 91, they were still strong, though they trembled a little more than they used to. But today, those hands, still sturdy in their own right, gripped a coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few older patrons scattered around the room, sipping coffee, lost in their own worlds. It wasn't anything special. Just a small-town diner, one of those places where the food was simple but the memories lingered long after the last plate had been cleared. The kind of place you go to when you don't need to impress anyone, just a seat at the counter and a cup of something hot. Henry had been coming to this diner for years. The routine was familiar. He sat in the same spot at the counter, staring out the window at the faded main street. The world had changed around him, but he hadn't. Not really. The older he got, the more he found comfort in things that stayed the same. But today? Today was different. The bell above the door chimed as the bikers walked in. There were 4 of them, all rough around the edges. The kind of men you didn't mess with. Their leather jackets gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights. Their eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, scanned the room like they owned the place. Boots thudded against the floor as they made their way toward the counter. Henry didn't react at first. He'd seen bikers before, years ago, back when the world seemed more dangerous and people wore their scars like badges of honor. He wasn't scared of them. Not anymore. But something about this group felt off. The leader of the gang, a tall man with a dark beard and a scar running down his cheek, walked directly toward Henry. He didn't say anything at first. Just stared at the old man. Henry returned his gaze, unflinching. There was no fear in his eyes. Just quiet strength. The leader leaned in a little closer, his breath heavy with the stench of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. "You've been in my way long enough," the biker growled, his voice low and threatening. Henry's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't let his emotions show. He had been through worse. A lot worse. He had survived the horrors of war, lost friends, and watched as the world shifted beneath his feet. He wasn't afraid of this man, not even with the intimidation in his eyes. "Don't know what you mean," Henry replied, his voice steady. The biker's lips curled into a sinister smile. "We'll see about that." He shoved Henry's shoulder as he moved past him, the force knocking the old man slightly off balance. The other bikers chuckled under their breath, their eyes glinting with amusement. Henry felt the tremor in his hands, but he steadied himself, taking a deep breath. He could feel his pulse quickening, but he didn't show it. The waitress, a young woman with a nervous smile, came over to take their order. But she was clearly trying to keep her distance from the group. The bikers weren't making anyone comfortable. They ordered their food loudly, making sure everyone in the diner could hear. Their voices were gruff, their language crude. But it was more than that. Henry could feel the hostility in the air, the silent threat hanging over the place. The bikers weren't here for a meal. They weren't just passing through. They were looking for something. Henry didn't know what it was, but he had a gut feeling that told him this was no accident. These men were here for more than just a bite to eat. The leader, after ordering a burger and fries, glanced back over at Henry. Their eyes met again, and this time, there was a glint of malice behind the dark sunglasses. "You think you can sit here and do nothing?" the biker asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Henry didn't respond. He simply took a sip from his coffee mug, his fingers tightening around the handle. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap. Then, without warning, the biker leaned forward, his face inches from Henry's. "I think you know exactly what's coming," he said. Henry's chest tightened. There was something in that voice that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. His heart raced, but he didn't back down. His mind was already spinning, piecing together fragments of information he hadn't fully realized until now. This wasn't random. This wasn't a chance encounter. These men weren't here by accident. And the more he thought about it, the more he understood. They were here because of him. They were here because he knew something. Something he had hidden for decades. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the world outside the diner almost fading away. The clinking of plates and the hum of the old jukebox in the corner seemed distant. The room felt suddenly small, like there was no escape from the menacing atmosphere they had created. Henry's thoughts raced. He had been through this before, many times. During the war, during the worst moments of his life, when everything seemed lost and hope was a distant memory. He had learned to survive then. And he would survive now. But how? He didn't have time to think. He looked at the waitress, who was nervously wiping down the counter, avoiding eye contact with the bikers. Then, without warning, he reached for his phone. It was an old flip phone, the kind that didn't do much more than make calls and send texts. But it was all he needed. His hands shook as he dialed the number. He knew exactly who to call. The phone rang twice. 3 times. His pulse raced with each second that ticked by. Then, on the 4th ring, a voice answered on the other end. "Henry? What is it?" "Get here now," Henry said, his voice calm but urgent. "I need you to bring the team." There was a brief silence. "You sure?" "I don't know if." "Just do it," Henry cut him off. "It's happened." "They know." The voice on the other end hesitated, then finally said, "We'll be there." Henry closed the phone, slipping it back into his pocket. He took another deep breath, his hands steadying once again. The bikers hadn't noticed the call, hadn't seen the shift in Henry's demeanor. They were too busy taunting the waitress, laughing at their own crude jokes. But Henry knew something they didn't. He wasn't alone in this fight. And they were about to learn that the hard way. As he sat there, the weight of the phone call hanging heavy in the air, Henry's mind flashed back to the years he had spent preparing for this moment. The plans, the alliances, the quiet movements that had gone unnoticed by so many. But today? Today would be different. The bikers would find out just how wrong they were to mess with Henry. And when the door swung open, signaling someone entering, Henry's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to look to know who it was. He could feel the tension shift in the air. Something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. This sets the tone for the rest of the story, building the suspense around Henry's past and hinting at something much larger than the immediate confrontation with the bikers. Let me know if you want to continue or need further adjustments. The door of the diner creaked open again, its familiar sound drowned out by the tension that hung in the air. Henry didn't need to turn around to know who had walked in. He could feel it in the way the room shifted, in the silence that followed. The bikers, their crude laughter echoing off the walls, paused for a split second, their attention suddenly diverted. One of them, probably the most aggressive of the lot, shot a quick glance toward the door. A sneer crossed his face, and he muttered something under his breath. But Henry could tell he was more confused than anything. It wasn't normal for anyone to come into this diner with so much intent. Henry let out a slow breath, his gaze still fixed on his coffee cup. His mind wasn't on the bikers anymore. He had done what he needed to. He had made the call. A shadow passed across the doorway, and then the footsteps followed, calm but deliberate. The familiar scent of leather mixed with the slight metallic tang of the morning air. Henry didn't move, didn't acknowledge the arrival of the person he was waiting for. He could hear the slow, steady approach, and knew without looking that it wasn't just one person. It was a group. The group he had called. Footsteps, one by one, filled the small diner. A quiet hush fell over the bikers, who exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to walking into places like this, used to making people cower, used to being the ones who set the tone. But something was different now. The air was thicker, colder, as if the room itself was bracing for something that was about to happen. The first figure entered the diner and made a beeline for Henry's side. His voice was low but firm. "Everything all right?" the voice asked. It was calm, smooth, reassuring. But Henry could hear the undertone of readiness, of alertness. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. His old friend, Jack, the one person he trusted completely. Jack's team was already in the diner, and each one of them blended into the background with an eerie quiet. Henry didn't answer immediately. He took another sip of coffee, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the reaction of the bikers. They were no longer laughing. No longer loud. Their eyes flicked from the door back to Henry, then back to the door again. Something wasn't right. The leader of the gang, the man with the scar, stood up from his seat, his fingers curling into fists. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice thick with menace. Jack didn't flinch. He gave the man a look that was unreadable. "People who don't like to see other people get hurt." The words were simple but had a weight behind them that immediately made the bikers hesitate. For a moment, the room was still, too still. The leader sized Jack up. He was used to intimidating people. He was used to making others back down with a glare or a snide comment. But Jack's presence was different. The way he stood there, with his hands casually by his side, didn't scream fear. It didn't scream submission. And that made the leader uneasy. "You think you can just walk in here and," the biker started to growl, but Jack cut him off with a single, sharp motion. "Sit down," Jack ordered. His voice wasn't loud, but there was an undeniable authority behind it. The kind of authority that commanded respect. The leader blinked, and for the first time since walking into the diner, he seemed to hesitate. The other bikers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Henry could feel their confusion, and he didn't need to look at them to know that they were wondering what was going on. They had walked in expecting an easy target. Now, they weren't sure if they were in the right place. "I said sit down," Jack repeated, his tone never changing. The leader, clearly seething with frustration, looked at his men, and after a long pause, he slowly lowered himself back into his seat. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but it shifted. The bikers were no longer in control. Jack stood still, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. The team behind him, 3 men and a woman, were strategically placed, their positions subtle but clear. None of them made a sound. They didn't need to. Henry, still sitting at the counter, felt a calmness wash over him. The old man's weathered fingers curled around the mug of coffee once more. He felt the years of experience in the pit of his stomach, the way his mind had learned to predict what was coming next. It was as though he could see the future unfolding right before him. He had been through this before. He had been in tight spots. Dangerous spots. But this? This was something else entirely. And it wasn't over yet. "You've made a big mistake," the leader of the bikers spat, his voice thick with anger. Henry finally turned toward him, his eyes locking onto the bikers with a quiet intensity. "I think you've made the mistake," he replied, his voice low and calm. The leader sneered at Henry, but before he could respond, Jack's voice cut through the tension again. "You don't get to make the rules here," Jack said, stepping forward. "You don't get to threaten people in this town and expect there to be no consequences." The words were simple, yet they had the power to shake the room. The bikers, who had been so sure of their dominance moments ago, suddenly seemed small in comparison to the calm authority emanating from Jack. Henry knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The phone call he had made was the first step in a long chain of events that would unfold over the next few hours. But what was coming wasn't just a fight. It was something much bigger. The bikers had no idea who they were really dealing with. "Get out," the leader of the gang growled, standing up again, clearly furious. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jack didn't flinch. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. And I know what you've done. All of it." Henry could see the change in the biker's face as the words landed. The scarred man's eyes flickered for a moment, uncertainty creeping in. He knew that he was being exposed. Henry didn't need to say anything more. The truth was out. Jack's words had hit their mark, and the bikers were starting to realize the gravity of the situation. The waitress, still standing off to the side, was now watching them, her eyes wide with fear and fascination. She had seen plenty of rough customers in her time, but nothing like this. The strange silence that had descended upon the diner was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Jack spoke again, this time in a softer tone, but with the same firm resolve. "This is your last warning. Leave. Now." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. The leader's hand twitched as if he were about to do something rash. But the sound of the door opening, soft but unmistakable, interrupted the moment. Another man stepped into the diner. Unlike the bikers, he wasn't there for food or trouble. He was there for something else entirely. He was tall, older than Henry but still with the same air of quiet authority. His sharp eyes scanned the room, noting the bikers, the team standing beside Jack, and Henry, still sitting calmly at the counter. He didn't speak right away, just gave Jack a quick nod. It was a silent signal, a sign that things were about to escalate. The man walked to the counter, his presence filling the space. His eyes met Henry's, and for a moment, there was understanding between them. "Seems we're all here now," the man said quietly. He looked at the bikers and then back at Jack, a smirk forming on his lips. "Let's finish this." Henry's grip on his coffee tightened, but he knew the worst was yet to come. The pieces were all in place. And the game was about to begin. The tension in the diner had thickened. For a moment, it seemed as though the world outside had faded away entirely, leaving only the clinking of plates, the heavy breath of the bikers, and the sharp presence of the team that had entered with Jack. The arrival of the older man had tipped the scales, but it also made things much more complicated. Henry remained seated at the counter, unmoving, his hands steady around his coffee cup, though his mind raced. He was acutely aware of the simmering energy in the room, of the momentary balance that hung in the air. It was fragile, like a live wire ready to snap. The man who had entered, the one who had exchanged the brief nod with Jack, wasn't just some random ally. Henry knew him. He'd known him for decades. It wasn't just the shared history between them, it was the weight of what this man represented. He had been a part of the network Henry had once relied on, back when he was still a soldier, back when the world was different. Now, as the bikers sat in stunned silence, Henry allowed himself a moment to breathe. The game had shifted, but the danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. The leader of the bikers, still simmering with fury, took a step forward. His eyes burned with hatred, but there was a flicker of something else, something less certain. He was clearly trying to maintain control of the situation, but the realization that he had underestimated the people in front of him was starting to sink in. Jack's team had taken up positions with a quiet efficiency. The three men and the woman had spread out, standing against the walls and blending into the surroundings. They had become shadows, their presence almost unnoticed by the bikers, who were too consumed with their own anger and confusion to notice the potential danger closing in around them. Henry's gaze flickered between the bikers and Jack's team, the older man standing beside Jack, who was calmly assessing the situation. There was something about the way they carried themselves, something that suggested this wasn't their first encounter with danger, with violence, or with people who made threats and promises they didn't intend to keep. The leader of the gang opened his mouth to speak, but the older man, who had yet to say a word, held up a hand. It was a small gesture, but one that was impossible to ignore. "You don't want to do this, the older man said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. Not here. Not now. The words hung in the air for a beat longer than they should have, and then the leader of the bikers scoffed, clearly unwilling to back down. I don't need you telling me what I want or don't want, he spat, his voice thick with contempt. We came here for a reason. And we're not leaving until we get it. The older man's eyes narrowed slightly. Then you'll be disappointed. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The room had reached a kind of stillness that was suffocating, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Henry took another sip of his coffee, his mind flicking through decades of memories. The moment was intense, but it wasn't unfamiliar. He had been in tight spots before. He had faced enemies far more dangerous than these bikers. What made this moment different was the weight of history, the knowledge that things had changed in ways the bikers had no way of understanding. The leader of the bikers, growing more agitated by the second, stepped forward again. This is your last warning, old man, he snarled at Henry. Get up. Walk out. Or things are gonna get ugly. Henry didn't flinch. He had faced worse. Much worse. He had seen men more terrifying than this biker, men whose names still haunted his nightmares, men who didn't make threats but carried them out with brutal efficiency. This was nothing. But it wasn't just about what had happened to him. It wasn't just about survival. It was about something deeper. Something much more significant. Henry had fought in wars, had buried friends, had seen the darkest parts of humanity. But one thing he had always believed was this: people didn't just fight for survival. They fought for something greater. Something more meaningful. The leader's fists clenched. I'm warning you, old man, he repeated, his voice rising. The older man, standing next to Jack, finally spoke again, his voice quiet but unwavering. You don't understand, he said, his words slow and deliberate. You're not here for what you think you are. This isn't a random encounter. You don't get to pick this fight. The tension in the room flared again, the bikers exchanging uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this. They had expected easy money, maybe some intimidation, maybe a little pushback. But this? This was something different. And they could sense it. They could feel the weight of history, of old wounds being stirred, of a storm gathering on the horizon. You don't know what you're dealing with, the older man continued. You're not just messing with some old vet. You're not just messing with the guy at the counter. You're messing with a network. A system you'll never understand. The leader of the bikers scoffed. A network? Are you serious? You think I care about your little group of friends? He laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. You should have stayed out of this. Now you're all gonna regret it. Jack stepped forward, his voice cold but steady. You're out of your league. The biker leader's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? What it means, Jack said, his voice dripping with menace, is that you've made a grave mistake. A mistake you're not going to walk away from. Henry didn't react outwardly, but inside, a deep, knowing feeling settled in his chest. This was no longer about intimidation. This wasn't about settling a score or defending a diner. This was something bigger, something far more dangerous. The older man, who had remained mostly silent, turned toward Henry with a slight nod. We've been waiting for this moment. It's time. The moment he spoke, the door to the diner swung open again, and a new figure stepped inside. It was a man in his early 30s, tall and lean, with an air of quiet confidence. He didn't say a word at first, simply glanced around the room, taking in the situation. The bikers seemed to shrink back at the sight of the newcomer, their bravado faltering for the first time since they had entered the diner. The man looked at Jack, then at the older man. He gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, and then, without a word, turned his attention to the leader of the bikers. "You're outmatched," the newcomer said simply. The bikers bristled at the words, but the sheer authority in the man's voice was enough to send another ripple of doubt through them. The room had shifted. No one spoke anymore. The bikers were no longer the ones in control. They were the ones being watched, being measured, and they knew it. Henry's heart beat slowly but steadily. He knew this game wasn't over. This was just the beginning of something far more complicated. These bikers had no idea what they had gotten themselves into, and by the time they realized it, it would be too late. Jack gave a single, subtle gesture to the team, and one by one, they moved. Each of them positioned themselves with perfect precision, each movement calculated. Henry watched it all unfold in a kind of detached calm, knowing that this moment would set everything in motion. The bikers had made their play. But they hadn't anticipated the network they were messing with. And now they were about to find out just how dangerous it could be. The leader of the gang took a step back, his expression flickering with doubt. "You think you can intimidate us? You think this is gonna stop us?" he spat. But Henry knew. They were out of their depth. The bikers had no idea that the real battle wasn't about who had the most muscle. It was about who had the most to lose. The air was thick with expectation as the bikers' leader stood frozen, trying to measure his next move. His crew flanked him, but they were visibly shaken, uncertain. They were used to being the bullies in any room they entered, but the calm authority of Jack, the older man, and the newcomer had thrown them off. They didn't know who they were dealing with, but they had a sinking feeling that they had made a mistake. The room was quiet, too quiet. The clinking of silverware, the usual hum of diner conversation, all seemed to fade into the background. The only thing that filled the space now was the weight of what was happening. Henry sat still, his hands folded on the counter in front of him, his eyes never leaving the leader of the bikers. He had been in far worse situations before, but this one felt different. There was something in the air, something almost palpable, that told him this wasn't just a random confrontation. This was going to change everything. Jack, standing a few feet away, remained as calm as ever. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, focused. He knew how to read a situation like this. He knew what kind of people these bikers were, loud, brash, and quick to violence. But he also knew that these bikers were nothing compared to the real enemies they would face. And in that knowledge, there was a sense of relief, even though the threat was still real. It was a reminder of who they were, of the strength they carried. The older man, whose silence had been constant until now, finally spoke again. His voice was low but carried a weight that made the air feel even heavier. "You don't understand the gravity of your situation," he said, his eyes locked on the leader of the bikers. "This isn't a fight you can win." The leader of the bikers scoffed. "You talk a big game, old man," he said, trying to regain some of the swagger that had been drained from him since he'd walked in. "But you don't know who you're messing with. I've got people. I've got connections." The older man didn't flinch. "Connections," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "You think your connections are going to protect you from what's coming? You think they're going to keep you safe from the mess you've created?" The leader hesitated, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his face. The others around him noticed it, and it seemed to drain the tension from their shoulders, but only for a moment. The reality of the situation was sinking in. They weren't facing just anyone. They were facing people with resources, with experience, with the power to make things go very wrong for them. Henry finally spoke, his voice carrying the weariness of years of experience. "You don't know the half of it," he said, his eyes meeting the leader's with a quiet intensity. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The words hit harder than anything Jack or the older man had said. It was the calmness in Henry's voice, the sheer certainty in his words, that sent a ripple through the group. The biker's leader took a step back, his eyes shifting nervously from Henry to Jack, to the older man, and finally to the newcomer who had entered just moments before. "Who are you people?" the leader finally demanded, his voice crackling with frustration. "You're about to find out," Jack replied, his tone flat but steady. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint hum of the diner's refrigerator, the muted sounds of a world outside that seemed so far away. And then, the door swung open again. The atmosphere in the diner shifted yet again. This time, the person who entered didn't belong to any of the sides in the room. He wasn't one of the bikers, nor was he part of Jack's team. This man was different. His presence wasn't as immediate as Jack's or the older man's, but there was something unmistakable about him. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his shoes gleaming. He didn't carry himself like anyone who'd ever been on a motorcycle or spent time in a rundown diner. He was the kind of man who exuded power, not through his body, but through his demeanor, the way he held himself, the way the room seemed to part when he entered. The bikers stiffened at the sight of him, their earlier bravado slowly draining away. The man didn't acknowledge the tension. He didn't seem to notice the stares, the fear in the air. He simply walked straight to the counter, his steps purposeful, his gaze never leaving the group. Jack's expression shifted slightly, but only for a moment. He seemed to know exactly who this man was. The older man's lips tightened, and he gave a slight nod, acknowledging the arrival of someone who clearly wasn't just a bystander. "Another one?" the leader of the bikers asked, clearly annoyed. "What is this, a circus? What do you people want?" The man in the suit stopped just behind the counter, his eyes scanning the room, his posture still relaxed, but there was an undeniable air of authority. He turned to face the leader of the bikers. "Do you know who I am?" the man asked, his voice smooth, his words cutting through the room like a knife. The biker leader sneered, clearly trying to regain his composure. "Does it matter?" he shot back. "We're not afraid of you." The man in the suit didn't flinch. "You should be," he said simply, his tone dark, unwavering. Henry, who had been watching the exchange carefully, allowed a small, knowing smile to flicker across his lips. This was the moment. The moment where things would finally take a turn. The bikers hadn't yet realized it, but they were caught in the middle of something far bigger than they could comprehend. The man in the suit wasn't here by accident. He had a purpose. And that purpose was going to bring everything crashing down. Jack and the older man didn't seem surprised by the newcomer. There was no change in their expressions, no shock, no sudden tension. It was as though they had been expecting him. They knew exactly who he was. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the man in the suit said again, his words still as sharp as before. "This is your last chance to walk away. Leave now, and we'll forget this ever happened." The leader of the bikers clenched his fists again, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk in here and tell us what to do? We don't take orders from people like you." The man in the suit didn't respond with words this time. Instead, he pulled a small device from his pocket, a simple phone, but there was something about it that made the atmosphere in the room change. He tapped a button, and the device emitted a low, almost inaudible hum. The room seemed to hold its breath. The biker's leader's eyes flicked nervously to his men, who were now exchanging uneasy looks. The man in the suit spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "You think you're in control here, but the truth is, you're not. You never were." As if on cue, the door to the diner swung open once more. And this time, it wasn't just one person entering. It was a group. The tension in the diner reached a fever pitch. These weren't just regular people. These were men and women who moved with purpose, with precision. They were armed, yes, but it wasn't the weapons that made them dangerous, it was the quiet strength in their eyes, the kind of strength that spoke of a life lived on the edge, of battles fought and won in silence. The bikers were no longer the biggest threat in the room. They had become outmatched. And the man in the suit had just revealed that fact. "You've been playing a dangerous game," the man in the suit said, his gaze cold. "But it's over now. Leave. Or face the consequences." The bikers, their courage now evaporating, exchanged frantic glances. The leader, the one who had been so sure of himself just moments ago, was now visibly shaken. He had underestimated these people. And now, he knew he couldn't win. Slowly, the bikers began to back off, moving toward the door, but not without hesitation. They weren't running yet, but they were about to be outmatched in ways they hadn't anticipated. Henry watched them with a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't the end of the story, not yet. But it was a turning point. And soon, the full weight of what had been set in motion would come crashing down on everyone involved. The silence in the diner was suffocating now. The bikers had backed down, but their retreat was not one of surrender. It was a tactical withdrawal, a temporary retreat, and everyone in the room knew it. The man in the suit, who had orchestrated this moment of control, stood still, eyes scanning the room, watching the bikers as they made their way toward the exit. The leader, his face flushed with anger, kept casting nervous glances over his shoulder, his pride wounded but his fear palpable. His crew followed, some reluctantly, others quickly, all aware of the gravity of the situation they had just barely escaped. The door slammed shut behind them, and for the first time in what felt like hours, there was a lull. Jack took a deep breath and slowly exhaled, his calm demeanor not betraying the intensity of the moment. He glanced at the older man, who nodded imperceptibly. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond forged through shared experience, through survival in the most extreme of circumstances. Henry, seated at the counter, let his gaze fall on the older man, a man whose name he knew but whose full story he didn't. Yet there was a connection there, something deep and unspoken. The newcomer in the suit, still standing in the center of the room, his hands neatly folded behind his back, shifted his weight, as if considering his next move. There was no panic in his body language, no urgency. He was like a stone in a river, unmoved by the waves crashing around him. "Are we done here?" Jack asked, his voice breaking the silence. The older man nodded again. "For now. But don't mistake that for peace." Jack leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. "I never do." The diner was eerily quiet, save for the soft clinking of coffee cups and the murmur of a few patrons who had remained in the background, too frightened to move. Everyone knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for now, the immediate danger had passed. The older man turned toward the newcomer in the suit, who still hadn't spoken a word since the bikers had left. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was something unsettling in the way he held himself. There was a purpose in his presence, an agenda that none of them fully understood yet. "Are they gone for good?" the older man asked, his tone more neutral than before. The man in the suit smiled faintly, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No. But the question is, are we prepared for what comes next?" The older man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked over at Jack, who was now eyeing the man in the suit with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Jack was always calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. This was no exception. Henry remained quiet, but his mind was already racing. He knew, instinctively, that they hadn't seen the full picture. There were layers to this situation, layers that would slowly peel away, revealing a much darker truth beneath. The bikers, though dangerous, were only the first wave of something larger, something far more insidious. The man in the suit might have momentarily tilted the scale in their favor, but Henry understood better than anyone that power didn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes, it came from silence, from control, from the manipulation of what you couldn't see. The man in the suit finally broke the stillness with a single word. "Follow me." Without waiting for a response, he turned toward the door, his footsteps firm and measured. Jack, The older man and Henry exchanged looks, then followed in silence. Outside, the sky had begun to darken. The cold of the evening had set in, and the streets were quieter than they should have been. The bikers were long gone, but the sense of danger still hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The man in the suit led them to a sleek black car parked at the curb. It wasn't the kind of car you'd expect to see in a place like this, where rusted vehicles and noisy motorcycles were the norm. No, this car was a statement, a symbol of the power and wealth of the person behind it. The man opened the back door and gestured for them to get in. Jack hesitated for only a moment before climbing in, followed by the older man. Henry, ever cautious, took his time, assessing the situation. He didn't trust the man in the suit, not yet. He wasn't sure who he was working for, or what his ultimate game was. But he knew that for now, their paths were aligned. The door shut behind them with a soft click, and the car began to move. It wasn't until they were well out of the diner's parking lot that the man in the suit finally spoke again. "We're not just dealing with a group of bikers," he said, his voice low but precise. That was just the tip of the iceberg. Jack turned his head toward him, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" The man in the suit's gaze remained forward, but his words carried the weight of something much larger. "The bikers are connected to a network, one that stretches across several states. And they're not just a street gang. They're involved in much deeper operations. The kind that can't be stopped with just a few punches or a stern word." Henry leaned forward, his interest piqued. This was the first real information they'd gotten. The first real lead. "I'm listening," he said, his voice steady, despite the sharp edge of curiosity running through him. The man in the suit glanced back at them, his eyes narrowing. "You've already seen how dangerous they can be. But you have no idea how far their reach goes. These are people who don't play by any rules. They control more than just illegal activity. They control industries, politicians, entire regions." The weight of the man's words landed heavily in the car, and for a brief moment, none of them spoke. It wasn't just the bikers they had to worry about. It was what they represented. They were a cog in a much larger machine, one that had no intention of being stopped by a handful of people who knew too much. "So, what's the play?" Jack asked after a long silence. The man in the suit smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. "We take them down. But we do it carefully. We move in shadows, make no noise. We strike at the core of their operations." Henry wasn't sure he liked the sound of that. "We can't just shadow our way out of this. We need hard intel. We need to know who's behind them, who's pulling the strings." The man in the suit nodded slowly. "That's where you come in. You'll gather the information. And we'll take it from there." For the first time in a long while, Henry felt the familiar stirrings of danger at the back of his mind. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about digging deep, uncovering the truth, and exposing something that could bring down much more than just a group of bikers. "We'll need time," Jack said, breaking the silence. "This isn't something we can rush into." "You'll have time," the man in the suit replied, "but only as long as it takes to gather what we need. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to stop them." They fell into a long, uneasy silence as the car sped down the empty streets. Henry sat back in his seat, staring out the window, his mind racing. They were in it now. And they were committed, whether they liked it or not. Outside the window, the world seemed unaware of the danger that was brewing. The world continued its quiet descent into the night, while inside the car, the countdown to something far greater had already begun. They were heading into the unknown, and there was no turning back. The car slowed as it pulled off the main highway and into a secluded area. There were no streetlights here, just the dark silhouettes of trees that flanked both sides of the road, casting eerie shadows. Henry watched the surroundings closely, his instincts on high alert. The air felt heavy, as if they were entering a place where no one was supposed to be, where secrets and threats lurked just out of sight. The man in the suit was quiet as he steered the car toward a small, unassuming building that seemed to blend into the darkness. It was an old warehouse, its walls worn down by time and neglect, with only a small flickering light visible through a cracked window. To anyone who didn't know what they were looking for, it would seem like a forgotten part of the city. But Henry knew better. The man in the suit didn't stop the car immediately. He kept driving slowly, as if testing the ground, before finally pulling to a stop just outside the warehouse. He turned the engine off, and the silence in the car seemed almost suffocating. Jack, seated beside him, was the first to speak. "Are we sure about this?" Jack's voice was low, but there was a sharp edge to it. It wasn't fear, but caution, a feeling that had kept him alive through far too many close calls. The man in the suit didn't answer immediately. He simply opened the door, stepping out into the night with smooth, deliberate movements. Henry exchanged a look with Jack and the older man. The decision had already been made. This was happening whether they were ready or not. "I guess we find out," Henry muttered, opening the door and stepping out. The cool night air hit him like a slap, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was a reminder of just how much was at stake. The man in the suit was already heading toward the warehouse, his steps quiet but purposeful. The three men followed, each of them alert, scanning the area. There was no telling what they would find inside, but whatever it was, Henry knew it would be important. This was the next step, the point of no return. As they reached the entrance, the man in the suit produced a small key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy metal door with a soft click. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a dark interior. The light from the outside world barely penetrated the darkness, and the warehouse smelled faintly of oil and rust. "We need to move fast," the man in the suit said as he stepped inside, his voice echoing in the empty space. The older man nodded, his hand instinctively resting near the concealed weapon at his side. Jack, too, was on high alert. He had been in situations like this before, places that were supposed to be abandoned, but were anything but. It was always in these forgotten corners that the true work was done. The work that could destroy lives. The warehouse was divided into several large rooms, each of them seemingly just as empty as the last. But Henry wasn't fooled. This was the heart of something bigger, a hub where plans were made, where deals were brokered, and where the true face of the operation was kept hidden. The walls felt like they were closing in, but he kept moving forward. They walked for what felt like an eternity through the dark corridors of the warehouse until they reached a metal door at the far end. This door was different, more secure, more guarded. A cold, metallic hum emanated from behind it. The man in the suit stopped in front of the door and turned to face them. "This is it," he said quietly. "What's behind this door is what you need. But be prepared. You won't like what you find." Henry didn't hesitate. He reached forward and gripped the door handle. As the door swung open, the air felt denser, heavier, as if the very atmosphere inside the room was thicker. The room itself was illuminated by a few dim lights, but it was what lay in the center that grabbed their attention. A long, polished wooden table stretched across the room, surrounded by chairs that looked far too expensive for a place like this. On the table, stacks of paperwork were scattered, along with several monitors displaying a maze of digital maps and coded data. It was all in a language Henry didn't immediately recognize, but he understood its importance. "What is this?" Jack asked, stepping forward cautiously. "It's a network," the man in the suit said, his tone more somber now. "The heart of it. This is how the bikers operate, how they move money, how they stay connected. But it's not just them anymore." The three men approached the table, studying the documents and the screens. A few things immediately stood out: photographs of people they didn't recognize, places they had never been, and references to high-level operations that seemed far outside the scope of a simple biker gang. This was bigger than anyone had anticipated. These bikers weren't just criminals, they were part of a much larger, far-reaching operation that had its tendrils in every corner of society. Henry leaned over one of the monitors, scanning the data. As he did, his mind raced. This wasn't just about stopping a gang, it was about uncovering a shadow empire that had somehow gone unnoticed by the public for years. Whoever was running this operation had deep pockets, high influence, and the kind of power that could change the course of history if left unchecked. Who else is involved in this? Henry asked, his voice tight with urgency. The man in the suit's face darkened. There are more players. Politicians. Corporate heads. Military contractors. People you would never expect. Jack shook his head. So, the bikers are just the muscle? The front? Exactly, the man in the suit said. But they're expendable. If the bikers go down, the rest of the operation will continue. But that's where you come in. You need to get to the core, the people running this show. Once you do, everything will fall apart. The weight of the man's words hung in the air, thick and oppressive. This was no longer about a few punks in leather jackets causing trouble. This was a war that would have repercussions far beyond the walls of this warehouse. Henry took a step back from the table, his mind racing. He could feel the danger all around him now, thick like smoke. They were standing at the edge of something monstrous, something they could never fully comprehend until they dug deeper. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. This isn't just about stopping the bikers, Henry said, his voice low. This is bigger. This is about taking down an entire system. The man in the suit didn't flinch. You're right. And it's going to take everything you have to bring it down. But first, we need to figure out who's behind it all. Jack turned toward him, his eyes narrowing. You still haven't told us who you are. The man in the suit's expression didn't change. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the work that needs to be done. Henry glanced around the room, his thoughts swirling. It was clear now that they had just entered a much darker world than any of them had anticipated. This wasn't a mission for a few days or even weeks. This was going to take everything they had. They would need to play the game smarter, more ruthlessly, and more quietly than ever before. We'll need more than just information, Jack said. We'll need allies, resources, time. The man in the suit gave a small nod, acknowledging the gravity of what was being asked. You'll have everything you need. But remember, the clock is ticking. The longer we wait, the more dangerous they become. Henry's gaze lingered on the table. The papers. The monitors. The maps. They were all pieces of a much larger puzzle, one that he was beginning to understand. And he had no choice but to see it through to the end. He was in now. There was no turning back. The first thing Henry noticed when they stepped back into the cold night air was the silence. The hum of the warehouse, the flickering lights, the dense air, all of it was left behind as they walked back toward the car. But even the darkness seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something to break. And it would. Henry could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The man in the suit had been right. There was no turning back now. They had seen the heart of the operation. They knew how deep it ran. But what they didn't know was who exactly was at the center of it all, the ones who could pull the strings from the shadows and walk away unscathed. The ones who could make the entire system fall apart with a single phone call. As they drove away from the warehouse, the city lights flickering in the distance, the tension in the car felt heavier. Jack was lost in his thoughts, his face hard, unreadable. The older man, too, seemed pensive, his eyes narrowed, lost in his own calculations. Henry couldn't help but replay everything in his mind, the documents, the photographs, the conversations. There were so many pieces to this puzzle, but it was starting to come together. They were playing a game with high stakes, a game where one wrong move could mean disaster. Where do we go from here? Jack asked, breaking the silence, his voice strained. You said we had the information we needed. Now, what? The man in the suit turned toward him, his expression unreadable. Now we make our move. We expose them. We cut the head off the snake. But we don't even know who they are, Henry pointed out. Not yet. The man in the suit's gaze darkened. We don't need to know everything. We need to know enough to take them down. And we have that. Henry sat back in his seat, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't sure about this. The man in the suit's confidence was almost unsettling. It was as though he believed they were already in control of a situation that was still spiraling out of their hands. But maybe he was right. Maybe the best way to strike at the heart of this operation was to cut through its weakest link. The plan, as they had been told, was simple: expose everything. Expose the criminals, the corruption, the network. Make it all public. But that kind of move had consequences. It meant going up against an empire, and not just the bikers. Their reach was so vast that it touched everything from small-town politics to major corporate interests. Whoever was at the top could pull strings that would shatter lives with a single whisper. As the car sped toward their next destination, the tension only grew. They were going to take down something that had been built in the shadows for years. No one was ever going to see it coming. Not until it was too late. They arrived at a large, nondescript building, one that, in the light of day, would have looked like any other corporate office. But tonight, it was their target. This was where the network's financial dealings were conducted, where dirty deals were made and signed away, hidden from the public eye. The man in the suit turned to them as they gathered in front of the building. All business now. Inside, you'll find everything you need to bring it down, he said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. We're not just fighting bikers anymore. We're fighting an entire system that will stop at nothing to protect itself. Don't trust anyone. Not even me. Henry exchanged a look with Jack. They didn't need to say anything. The reality of the situation had set in long ago. They were all in this now, whether they wanted to be or not. They entered the building through a back entrance, the door creaking open to reveal an empty hallway, dimly lit by fluorescent lights. The silence was unnerving, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Follow me, the man in the suit said, leading the way. They walked quickly, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet hallway. They reached a security door at the end of the hall. The man in the suit punched in a code and opened the door, revealing a small room filled with computers and filing cabinets. Everything they needed to dismantle the operation was in here. It was like a digital vault, a treasure trove of secrets. This is where you'll find the evidence you need, the man said, his voice low. Hack the system, get what's hidden here. That will expose everything. Henry stepped forward, his fingers already moving over the keyboard. The process was slow at first, but as they began to dig deeper, the weight of what they were uncovering became apparent. Files. Contracts. Names. And more names. All tied back to the bikers, but then, there it was, a list of politicians, business moguls, and military figures. People who had their hands in this network. Powerful people. Untouchable people. This is it, Jack said, his voice tight. This is what they've been hiding. Henry's mind raced as he scanned the documents. The connections were clear now. The bikers were just a small part of the picture. These were players at the highest level, people who controlled entire industries, and the bikers were merely pawns in their game. There's more, Henry said, his voice strained. Look at this. He highlighted a file that stood out, a financial statement that tied back to a specific name. A name Henry recognized. A name he never thought he would see in this context. It was the name of someone they all knew, someone who had played a part in the entire mess. Someone who was directly connected to the very people they had been fighting against. It was the man in the suit. Henry froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Jack turned to him, his expression unreadable, but Henry could see the question in his eyes. Was this the twist they had all been waiting for? "Why didn't you tell us?" Henry asked, his voice low, dangerous. "Why didn't you say anything?" The man in the suit turned slowly, his face an impassive mask. "I didn't tell you because I didn't need to. But now you know." Jack moved toward him, his stance aggressive. "You've been playing us this whole time, haven't you?" The man in the suit didn't flinch. "I've been playing everyone. But the game's over now. The pieces are in place, and it's too late to stop it." The room fell silent. Henry could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of rage and disbelief swirling inside him. The man in the suit wasn't just a player in this game, he was the architect. The mastermind. And they had just handed him everything he needed to finish what he started. "You were never going to bring this down," Henry said, stepping back from the computer. "You were always going to take it for yourself." The man in the suit's smile was cold, knowing. "Exactly." He turned away from them, heading toward the door. "You'll understand soon enough." As he walked out of the room, Henry and Jack stood frozen. The truth had hit them harder than any punch. They had been part of a larger plan, one that they hadn't fully understood until it was too late. And now, they were left with only one choice: to fight back. But it would be a fight unlike any they had ever imagined.